Good morning and welcome to this webinar on preparing for a volunteer management system. I'm Wendy Halley and I've been in various volunteering roles in the charity sector for many years. Volunteering management, volunteering development, even a little bit of community fundraising in there too. Now, Assemble tendered for the VMS contract with us at Save the Children, and after implementing it there, I went on to do the same at another charity before now coming here to Assemble and to be the Associate Product Manager here, looking after all the developments and new features that we're adding. So today, over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you some experiences from the sector, what to expect, what to do, and maybe more importantly, what not to do. It's not about selecting a VMS or even in terms of looking at your requirements, because that's a whole other session on its own. In fact, it could take two to do that. So instead, I'm going to focus mainly on the time in the run up to implementation, what's likely to happen during it, and how you can get ahead with some key information, decisions, and actions. And there should be some time for questions at the end, and I think you'll have seen the announcement that you can just post those in the questions part of the panel there. So I'm going to turn off my camera so that those of you on smaller screens can see the slides more easily. Hopefully that's right now. Let's get on. If you're in volunteering, you're probably used to having to wait to get the funding and resources for many things. But a VMS, it's likely to be one of your biggest investments, so you want to make it count. It's been 13 years since I first got involved with volunteer management systems of one kind or another. Before then, it was really just a module on the CRM, like a tick box to say someone is a volunteer as well as a supporter. Well, the modern VMS has taken us a long way in the past decade or so, and more charities, NHS organisations and other not-for-profits have been adding a VMS to their resources. And it's great. The difference that a good VMS can have on both the day-to-day volunteer management as well as the volunteer journey is fantastic. It feels like a whole new world. But I'm not going to lie to you. It will take work and planning to get the most from your system. Of course, every organisation is different, has its own challenges, and we've got people here today with a dozen or so volunteers and others with thousands. They may be on different scales, but volunteering is volunteering. There's all the obvious stuff to get into, and we will cover most of it in this session, but I want to start with something that can come back to bite you later if you don't get it set very early. What's a volunteer? To you, to your organisation, who is a volunteer? Now, that may seem obvious. I'm sure you can think straight away of Izzy or Ian and know they're a volunteer. But here's the thing. Where's the line between the supporter and volunteer? And are you clear on it? And if you are, is everyone? The clue is clearly in the name. It's a volunteer management system managing volunteers. The volunteering team may know that for all volunteers, we need this data, a selection process, some kind of training or information to stay safe and legal. But without setting out clearly that definition, who's in for this project and who's out of scope, you can wind up getting caught in a lot of discussion and even in mid-project changes as the implications of the implementation actually become clear to everyone. And the most commonly blurred lines are probably within community fundraising. It's best summed up probably as the difference between in aid of fundraisers and on behalf of ones. So if you haven't already, I'd strongly recommend that you start by getting a definition of a volunteer for your organisation, with examples of it being applied in your own real-world situations, and get it agreed from the top. It just allows you to cut through the detail later on as the principles are all there and they can just be applied, because everything in the end will come back to it. Now, the most obvious aspect, of course, to turn your attention to early on is data, your volunteer data. Now, if you're coming from another VMS, this may not be too hard to do. And indeed, if you're a smaller organisation, that may not be challenging. But if you're in a larger organisation or anywhere, to be honest, without centralised recruitment and management, yeah, things can get interesting. What data do you have? Is it up to date? Is it complete or just the basics? Or are you actually in the position of just not having much? If that's you, I'll let you in on a secret. You are not alone. Honestly, you'd be surprised how many organisations struggle to get together their volunteer data due to there just not really being any volunteer data. And often that's one of the key reasons for getting a VMS anyway. So what data are we talking about? You can expect to need some fundamentals, but there's a lot of secondary stuff too. And of course, consistency, formatting, etc. At some point that's going to be needed, but you may not want to gather all the data in too early. It's live data, it's being used all the time, you hope. So will go out of date very quickly. So you want to get prepared on data, know what you're going to need, where your gaps are, and how you're going to fill them, or when. Because you may not want to do this before implementation. It's a truism, of course, to say bad data in, bad data out. So it certainly would seem to be a good idea to get everything accurate and up to date before you start. Bear in mind, though, that if you're going to want volunteers to log into a new VMS, getting them to check their data at that point may be a better move. It gives a specific reason for them to log in, and you don't ever want to ask volunteers to do the same thing twice. So perhaps it may be better to get your initial check of data just down to who is a volunteer and any obvious errors or gaps rectified. And for that, you can ask your managers. At least then you should avoid the major errors like adding in people who maybe haven't actually volunteered for years. You don't want to be paying, of course, for lots of licenses that you don't need or add ex-volunteers as current ones. And with GDPR, you certainly don't want to hang on to data for longer than required. But if you already have the data being stored somewhere, getting it all centralized in one system to sort out might be a good idea. I once took over an area where a volunteer with a role, I'd say, of some significant trust and access was just listed as Dave. That was it, honestly. Someone somewhere had a phone number, but I didn't have it on the CRM. Maybe a good recruitment process had been followed, but there weren't exactly any records to back it up. So again, if you're looking to bring in all of the different recording formats, even if ostensibly for the same processes, then be prepared to have to make some compromises. You may need to pick what to prioritize to fix now and what just to accept and as sort of the way things are at the moment, and then move on to that brighter future. But I would just say this though, be very cautious about trying to fill in the missing recruitment processes for existing volunteers. If you don't have their application forms or references taken up, it could be very badly received to do this retrospectively. So maybe again, just accept it for now and move on, if you can. Get ready for surprises though, and here's one that again will probably only apply to those organisations with devolved volunteer management, and particularly when recruitment is done locally. You know all those lovely processes you have, the nice application forms, selection meeting, references. Yep, well, you may well find out that these agreed or even mandated processes are not quite as embedded as you thought. Again, you would not be the first if that's what you discovered was happening. Lifting the bonnet on your local volunteer management can throw up all sorts of surprises. So you may not just be dealing with getting the data all collected, checked, and formatted. There could actually be more work than you're expecting with training and supporting managers in the processes. Volunteer management training and communication is clearly a longer term and an ongoing requirement in any organisation of any size. Making sure that everyone with volunteer management responsibilities actually does know the processes, has the competence, the confidence and capacity to be effective volunteer managers. What has this to do with preparing for a VMS? Well, there's something really, really important to say here. A volunteer management system doesn't manage volunteers. Volunteer managers do. A VMS can keep them on the right path when it comes to process, requiring what you require to be done before being allowed to move on to the next stage, taking a lot of administrative weight from them, yes, especially around recruitment. But we all know that that's just a small part of volunteer management, and no VMS can deliver a good volunteer experience for your volunteers. It can only support it. So you still need to make sure that all of your managers know good volunteer management practice. A challenge, I know, with all the frequent staff changes that organisations can experience. But there's another reason to embed this early, and this brings me to a don't do. Don't blame the system. Explain the process. What do I mean by this? Well, when you've got a manager who's busy with 100 other things to do and has been merrily running their own little volunteer processes beyond your reach, let's be honest, probably no process, it could be a pretty big shock to them to suddenly have to get those pesky application forms completed or references taken up, training done, or whatever else is required, but been quietly ignored for years. No one likes change, of course, and some resistance is pretty common, even if it's a process that makes sense and has actually always been required. When you're faced with it, it can feel like you're holding the ace. You have to do this way, the system needs it. Don't play that card. You'll be setting yourself up for opposition to the system that will reduce their work and help implement the process that's meant to be being done. You're going to need staff to use the VMS, and if you try taking this quick way out on this one point, you could actually create a lot more work for yourself in future. So separate out volunteer management, your process, why it's important, and deal with that independently. In the same way that a VMS can't manage volunteers, it also can't manage your culture change, only support it. If you don't have the time or resource to deliver actual training, just consider your comms with volunteer managers. Drop in the process, best practice and other tips as you go. They'll take and reinforce all of your existing processes and training that you've already got in place, as well as set up managers for a smoother transition. But what about some practical tasks? Well, first, your roles and role profiles or role descriptions. Are they up to date? Do you need them all, or could you merge some? If you're able to, doing a review before you need to start adding all of these to your shiny new VMS could be a really good idea. And with the benefits around communication with your volunteers that a VMS brings, you can actually make your role profile fairly broad, with day-to-day detail being communicated in other ways. So, do you need 15 different admin volunteer role profiles, or just one more general one that can be applied to the different departments? You'll also want to consider your role's training requirements. A centralised matrix of all training and all roles is never going to be wasted work. You'll have other data requirements too, but getting training all agreed, documented and signed off as you prepare for the VMS will reduce hold-ups later on. Now, this next one is a bit more of a nice to have, but it is a really nice one to do for a document library. Give all of your volunteer documents, videos, policies and resources a review. It's a good way to engage staff from all departments, and it's always nice to spotlight volunteering anyway. It gets them to make sure that their information is accurate and up to date. And if you give it all a quick once over to make sure everything is fully branded and fresh, it will give volunteers another clear difference and another reason to log into the VMS. Now you've got your list of roles confirmed, it's a really good idea to look at all of the processes that you currently use. Now, the basics around recruitment, what you'd be audited on, that's a good starting point. But it can also be a good opportunity to review what you currently do, work out what's actually required, and what you may be doing simply because of the tools that you've had access to. Now, this is a linear process way of looking at things, and I found that it can be quite a different way of thinking for some volunteering teams and volunteer managers. A flowchart, that can be a good way to help people visualize that process, because sometimes, and it depends, that doesn't really translate into any computer system. Depends on what and when. It also allows you to ask at each point, is this step actually adding any value? I had one rather complex process for recruitment once. Working with the managers and the admins, importantly, who dealt with it day to day, we plotted out the process to a 25-step flowchart. We then worked out what we actually wanted, and it was 6 steps. I spoke with Brian Reeves, who's head of volunteer experience at the RSPCA. Now, they've had Assemble for 5 years now, more actually, and Brian's been on that journey from the start. I asked him if he could go back in time and give himself some advice, what would it be? He said not to be wedded to your processes, as they may not be the most efficient way to do things. Instead, take the opportunity to review them. He also made another really good point about compromise. You'll have to. At some point, during scoping, tendering, contracting, or implementing a VMS, or any system come to that, you're going to need to compromise. If you keep, though, the end goal, the outcome in mind, the most streamlined process is probably going to be the one built into the VMS, so you'll still achieve what you need to. Now, defining what success is for any project will normally be derived from the description of the problem or issue that you're trying to solve. But in volunteering, there can often be a lot of different ones, and you may well have needed to outline them all to different stakeholders during the process of getting buy-in for a system. At some point, though, you're going to have to show how your VMS has delivered for you. So take some time during the preparation to look down the road at what success will look like. You're going to need some kind of metrics. Is it to get all your data in one place? Well, that's maybe quite a nice one to quantify. Like all the different sources of data that you collected. And yes, I did get carrier bags of application forms dumped on me as records. Faster recruitment, well, you'll need to make sure you have your starting point to compare with later on. Do take care of the engagement ones, though. Managers logging in at least once a week, once a month, yeah, that's absolutely fine. But for volunteers themselves, it can be a slower burn, so do allow for that. The one to be super cautious of, though, is increasing the number of volunteers. Remember all that data collection you've done? Maybe that volunteer definition too? Well, that can result in your number of volunteers actually falling. Of course, it's just getting to the accurate figure, but you may have been overestimating numbers for some time. So preparing senior managers for this possibility is a good idea. Volunteering teams may have been trying for many years to get the business case passed for VMS. We're often last in line for funding, so by the time you get it all signed on the dotted line, it can feel like that is success. However, you'll be needing to communicate with all of your stakeholders as you start work preparing for and then implementing your VMS. And as you do that, you're going to need to explain the advantages and benefits to get them on board. And here's another don't do for you. Don't oversell. This is one I've definitely done and deeply regretted. It's a big thing. You may have had to wait years, patiently playing a complex game of chess to get all of your pieces in the right place to win approval for the VMS business case. It could be the center of your life and you're rightly excited about it. And the temptation is to get everyone as excited and looking forward to it as you are. That will definitely get staff behind you, but are you raising false expectations? A VMS is brilliant, really is, and will solve loads of your volunteering team's issues. But will all of your managers perceive it in exactly the same way? When you did your requirements gathering, you'll have been faced with a lot of issues that a VMS can't solve. You'll also have others that didn't quite make the cut along the way. This is where setting out clearly the what, why, and when of your VMS project is so vital. Like, compromise is always going to be a watchword in implementing any system. Setting out what will definitely be delivered and what you're hoping to as well is great, but also set out what won't be. What's out of scope, managing expectations there too. It was Alan Murray from RSPB way back in 2015 who gave me some sage VMS advice. Essentially, it was that understanding the requirements sometimes means not giving people what they want, but what they need, or what you know they will need. By understanding the detail of what the actual requirements are, you may not, in the end, deliver what they think they want. You definitely want to get everyone involved though, and early. Any change management can be a long process, so starting to drop in information about a new system can only be a good move. But more than that, having a really keen understanding of volunteer and manager concerns, issues and wish lists is so important for engagement. Now, you'll have done some of this as part of the scoping and requirements gathering, even if it's very light touch without formally labeling it as such. But you really do want to understand all users' perspectives. As you prepare for your VMS, you'll also be needing to plan out the implementation. And that will almost always mean some kind of staggered, phased release, unless you're in a very small organization. So this is your chance to find those keen beans, the managers who are really on board and can see the benefits. There can be great learnings, perhaps, from the more challenging stakeholders. But you know, at the beginning, you'll have a lot to think about, so you may find some positive early users able to be your ambassadors to their colleagues. Well, that's my preference. Senior managers, well, you'll probably need to get some sign-off for some processes and decisions, so getting all of that into packed meetings timetable, well, it can take some time. And then there are the others, the staff who aren't directly involved in volunteering, but you need them to know about it. Don't forget them. Your IT team may well have stepped back from an off-the-shelf SaaS product, but what about integrations? Meanwhile, a comms and marketing team won't appreciate a shock launch of a new system they were unaware of. Finance, they may need to tweak processes for volunteer expense claims, and the web team might have to update the website or some links. How much volunteers will truly engage with any VMS is pretty variable and depends on many, many factors. But there will probably also be differences over time, and tomorrow's volunteers are likely to be increasingly demanding digital access. But like your volunteer managers, no one likes surprises. The only way is to take your volunteers with you, involve them early on, understanding their volunteering experience as it may be framed by a VMS, and that is perhaps slightly different perspective to your current one. You may well find that a lot of this engagement work with volunteers will need to concentrate on reassurance and calming some digital fears. Interestingly, I've often found that staff perceive volunteers' digital capabilities to be far lower than they actually are. But there is a difference between being online and being confident online. So taking it slow and understanding the need for explanation, reassurance, and I'd say the best tactic of all is taking all the pressure off. People engage more when they feel it's a choice, not when they're backed into a corner. You can disarm even the most reluctant volunteer with, nothing is changing, you'll still have your manager, you don't have to use it. Brian from RSPCA said he thanks his lucky stars that they planned a slow approach to rolling it out, reviewed the plan and slowed it down even more. Going at the pace your volunteers and staff can take has to be balanced with the organisation's desire, of course, to see a return on investment. But that pace can certainly be maximised with good early preparation. Going out to local teams was a big investment in time for Brian, and I think from memory, he did a lot of that himself, but it really helped him in the planning. I also want to share a great idea from the RSPCA. Part of their implementation included early distribution of these postcards to the various shops, groups and committees. And by the way, it is honestly just a coincidence they happen to match the colours of my PowerPoint today. They're really cheap to produce in bulk, these kind of postcards or business card type things, and they really hit the right note with the RSPCA volunteers at the time. Apparently, many have kept them and they're still seen on fridges and on notice boards. Branded items celebrating volunteers and volunteering always seem to be popular. But here's just a final don't do from me. If you're buying an off-the-shelf VMS, don't rename it. It can seem like such a fantastic way to engage volunteers. Name the new system. But it just causes problems later. Everything coming out will be in a different name from the one your volunteers know, and we have a significant number of volunteers actually with different charities using Assemble in them all. With a different name on one, well, it can just lead to unnecessary confusion. A VMS has the potential to revolutionise your volunteering and support your organisation, managers and volunteers well into the future. When you look at preparing for your VMS, it really comes down to three things: data, process and people. The technical stuff, that's the easy bit. It's the people that need the time, not just getting managers and volunteers ready, but also getting all of the required decision makers to sign off on the more general volunteering stuff that you might need to review. If you can get all of your processes, roles and requirements agreed, it will make your technical setup much faster. Check your managers know the good practice volunteer recruitment and management, and that they know they still will be the managers. And bring your volunteers along with you. Give everyone loads of time to understand what's happening, what it means for them, and how the VMS will help the organisation deliver. I hope that some of that has been helpful to you today, but please do go to our website if there's anything you want to know about Assemble itself. We'll also send you an email later today with a link to the recording and who to contact if you'd like more information. However, with the number of people at this webinar today, we didn't want anyone to have to wait for us to get through those replies. So if you have any specific questions about Assemble and would like someone to get in touch, there's a poll, I think, that's going to come up on screen any second, and you can request that in there. But we've got time for a few questions if anyone has anything more general they'd like to ask from today's webinar. So I think one question had come in. Do you have any suggestions for phased releases and how to decide what goes first? Turn on my camera. It's going to depend very much on your organisation and what your priorities are. I have very much looked at, as I say, finding the people who are particularly keen, and also do consider geography, particularly if you're national. There's a tendency for us to put any of our local pilots or phasing of anything near us. And if that's London, that can be quite alienating. So I've deliberately chosen away from London when I've been based here, so that there's a bit of space and it feels like we're involving the whole of the organisation. You don't want to go out with a whole big tranche of people. So if you've got a lot of volunteers in retail, you don't want to go out with all of your shops at one go. Pick on an area, as I say, perhaps away from London or away from near wherever your central office is, and then gradually move out from there. What I would say is, though, as Brian said, phasing your features as well is a good idea. People can only take so much on at any time, one time. So don't overawe people with too many new features all in one go. Whatever you do, communication is the big thing. Explain a bit more about the requirement gathering stage and the best approach to it. Wow, yeah, it's probably a lot harder than most people anticipate. It kind of feels nice, like, what would you like? Oh, I want to be able to recruit. It's like, okay, fine, how, what? You've got to actually dig below it. So I've always done workshops, and I actually don't call them requirements gathering. And there's a very specific reason for that. If people hear requirements, they tend to have a shopping list in mind. And what they're actually doing often is just telling you something about the way they currently work or something they've seen elsewhere. And what you're wanting to do is get underneath that and really understand what they need. So I've run what sometimes seem to be a little bit of just a venting session where I've had maybe everyone from fundraising or community fundraising in a room. I do love my post-its, so giving everyone post-its and getting them to answer 2 questions. And that is, what problems or issues do you face day to day in volunteering, volunteer management, some kind of framing like that? And the second question would be, what do you wish you knew or knew more of? And it's just to get people to think beyond the practical, I want to press this button and it does that. We don't want that. You want to understand what they're trying to achieve. So by breaking it into those questions, I find I'm able to get underneath exactly what it is that they are wanting, and really get to that deeper understanding. From there, that's when you're then working out your scoping of requirements for the organisation. And doing that across different departments I've found is quite helpful. So I think there are a couple of questions about Assemble itself, which I'm not going to cover today. And as I say, we've got people who will definitely be able to answer those more generally. Oh, another one, what data do we need to get? So you're going to want to get, to be honest, probably as much as you can. You will always need the basics, who the person is, first name, surname, and a contact detail of some kind. And quite honestly, for some of your volunteers, that's all you will have. If you have a lot of collection volunteers for your annual street collection, you might just have first name, surname, and email address. Okay, that's what it is. But the more you have, obviously, the better. And more than anything is, you want to get all of that information in from wherever it's being stored. And people store information in all sorts. As I say, old application forms in carrier bags, spreadsheets, notebooks, an amazing array of data sources will come. So having a little bit of a data amnesty, should I say, even asking them to send in a copy or an example so that you can get an idea of what you're working with, and then pulling that. Almost always, though, you're going to want all of your data in. If you've got data on volunteers, that's what you want to get in. Minimum, your absolute basics, who they are, and also, of course, what they do, what their role is. So another one, who should I include in my project team to scope it out? It's a good question. I mean, again, there's a whole lot. I've worked in the charity sector for too long. I know there's lots of politics in there. You're going to have to consider all of that. It's always, of course, you've got such a variety of different sizes of organisation. If you've got access to a business analyst, if you've got access to project managers, then absolutely. You definitely want your volunteering team involved. You definitely want your IT team or someone from there involved. And then get representatives from your different departments, divisions, stakeholders. Make sure that anyone who's involved in volunteering, even tangentially, is involved in the project, because you're wanting to take them with you. In terms of volunteers, it can be a bit more complex as to how much you bring in. And again, that's down to the culture of the organisation. For some organisations, volunteer voice is absolutely central and core, and they are very, very much involved in day-to-day decision making. If that's your organisation and your culture, you want to follow that. For others, it would be less so. So it just really does depend. But regardless, do not forget your volunteers. Make sure that they are understanding what is coming if it's affecting them, and so you do need to bring them along. Okay, I think I'm very pleased my voice has held out, because I was worried about that. So I think that's probably us now, out of time. I do hope some of that's been helpful. You'll get an email later on, and thank you very much for coming. Have a good rest of the day.